institutional.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me just get my slides. So, yeah, I want to start just by thanking Katie and Gail and everyone at the Royal College of Physicians for inviting me. It's been great to hear more about such an exciting exhibition. And thank you also to Sam for being such a hard act to follow, particularly in your beautiful slides, which I think put mine to shame slightly. Today, I'm going to be talking about the relationship between books and people. The two questions that my work broadly asks are how much a collection name attached to a library is a reflection of the actions of that person named, and what are our responsibilities towards those actions. So I'm going to begin by laying out some of the histories of institutional libraries like this one and sort of complicating the picture of acquisition a little bit. Then I'll begin to be thinking about the ways in which it might be troubled, and finally, about what we might do with those histories moving forward. So I think this has really come out in the first two papers, is the extent to which the history of an institutional library is really the history of lots of individual libraries or personal book collections. Looking something like this. And this is true until, I would say, the mid sort of 18th century, is that the distinction that we see today between individual personal collections and institutional libraries just aren't as clear-cut or as defined as they are now. When Thomas Linacre founded the Royal College of Physicians in 1518, he didn't just do so in the sense of sort of intellectually creating an institution. He bequeathed his own house and his own books to the college. Institutional collections had long grown through this sort of culture of benefaction. From the late medieval period onwards, it's fairly common for scholar monks to donate manuscripts from their studies to their monasteries or cathedral libraries. Oxford and Cambridge College libraries similarly grow out of donations from their fellows and alumni. And the scale is much smaller. We're really talking about hundreds of books rather than thousands. And that means that individual donations have quite a lot of power in shaping a collection. I think the Lancelot Brown example is a really helpful one to illustrate that, the kind of how significant one person's interests can be in determining what a library has. There are other ways, however, that donors can make their mark. It's important that gifts to a library do not have to take the form of books directly. You could also give money so that a librarian or someone else well-placed could purchase a book that the institution actually wanted or needed. If this was the case, your name would still be recorded in the donors list and in some cases appended in the book that was bought. This is still the case today. Some of the most famous named collections I work with are named after the person who paid for the purchase rather than anyone who actually owned the book. For example, the majority of the books in Cambridge University Library, which carry the bookplate of donation from King George I, and which are described as being part of the Royal Library, were never actually owned by him, but by Bishop John Moore, who died in 1714. Moore's large collection was purchased by the king and donated straight to the University Library in order to mark his coronation. The Royal Library bookplates were engraved by John Pine in the 1730s, and offer the legend Munificenta Regia 1715. There's a disconnection in those books between the owner and collector figure, Moore, and the donor figure, George. The books bear the name of the latter rather than the former. So already that simple chart begins to look a little bit different. What's important here is that from the catalogue presentation of these books, a user might not be able to tell the difference between these two pathways. The association of a name with a book can mean that someone owned and used the book extensively, that annotations are theirs, that it was a deliberate gift and a reflection of their intellectual interests, as with Brown. But it could also mean that they never saw it and someone else purchased it on their behalf. So why bother? To give or donate a book to an institution has long been a successful way of creating a legacy for yourself. It goes beyond philanthropy. If you believe that your library is representative of even an extension of your individual mind, then the survival of your named collection can also be understood as survival of you. Samuel Pepys was certainly concerned with this kind of memorialization. In 1703, in a codicil added to his will the month he died, Pepys laid out his scheme for the completion and settlement of my library. The codicil instructed his nephew and heir that the library should be given into the care of an Oxford or Cambridge college, preferably his own alma mater of Magdalen College, Cambridge, that it should be named after him, that the bookshelves should remain with the books. For Pepys, not unusually for the period, the sense of his library included the furniture as much as it did the texts. And he had his bookshelves specially made. He sort of is connected with the open-faced glass case that we're familiar with today. And he requested that his library remain more or less unchanged, that it wouldn't be added to or incorporated into a larger collection. These instructions, he explained, were necessary to prevent the ordinary fate of such collections falling into the hands of an incompetent heir and thereby being sold, dissipated, or embezzled. So by this point in time, it wasn't uncommon for private libraries to be dispersed upon the death of their owner and creator if you didn't set kind of strict guards against that happening. Collections were liable to be sold off either piecemeal or as a whole, upon which point the books would be folded into the collections of others. These sales were sometimes undertaken under the name of the deceased. You can frequently see the way that the potential buyer is told that they are being offered famous libraries of very learned men they either have heard of or, the catalogue suggests, probably should have done. This isn't always the case. There are cases where sales are described as being lately the library of an eminent merchant or a gentleman. And I think that demonstrates the potential for the relationship between collections and the named owner to either be insisted upon or disrupted according to the power of external forces such as the market. It appears that a name might add value to a collection or decrease it. We value things, in almost every sense of the word, more if we know that they have belonged to someone famous. And it provides a really good way in to collections. On the Royal College of Physicians website, you can see several interesting or notable owners identified. And if you go into the catalogue, you'll see other names noted in the provenance field. Provenance is one of the attributes that helps turn a printed copy of a book into something unique. It turns it from a replaceable object into something irreplaceable. It's usually identified two ways. The first is internal to the copy. It might have ownership inscriptions, which can be names or mottos, stamps or idiosyncratic cataloguing codes. But it also might be external, sales records, catalogues, or diary entries. And we've seen examples of both of those already. It's worth mentioning too that sometimes provenance marks can be absent or removed. Although we tend to value any clue of the past lives the books might have led before reaching us, this has not historically been the case. Many early modern books bear marks of obliteration, crossed out inscriptions, especially names, and these can sometimes be more difficult to spot than you might expect. The example to the left of the screen has been dry erased, so something has been scraped out of the page. And in other examples, the book's brown stained end leaf might be the sign of a wet erased inscription, so washed to remove the ink. It could also be the sign of a more natural stain, the mark of the passage of time, rather than an act of human intention. I think that provenance shapes our interaction with library objects far more than we might realise. The names of former owners and important donors are everywhere in a library once you start to look for them. Even when their names aren't there, they've often shaped the form that library collections take. Some donors require their books to be kept together, to be shelved in a particular way, and although these requests aren't as commonly followed anymore, they certainly used to be. And all of that feeds into things like the order in which books appear to you, searching for the online catalogue. I think that the individual donors and the sort of complicated histories of donation shape the research that gets done far more tangibly than we might sometimes think. So the question becomes, how do we recognise the complexities of these pasts without losing sight of the value of provenance information? In August 1700, Christopher Codrington, the colonial governor and bibliophile, set sail for the West Indies. He did so amidst a wave of gossip. This was not gossip about the fact that his family wealth derived from sugar plantations in Antigua and Barbados, which were worked by several hundred slaves, but gossip about to whom he might have left his books in the will that he had recently drawn up. Would it be a public institution such as the Bodleian? Would it be to a college? Or would it be to a friend or family member, passing from one individual to another? In fact, Codrington hadn't decided. The 1700 will explains that he'll leave it up to his executors and trustees to decide where best to bequeath the library. But by 1702, he had revised his plans. He left £10,000 to All Souls College, Oxford, £6,000 of which was for the building of a library, the other £4,000 for the purchase of books to furnish the same. He also left his own book collection to All Souls, although the majority of those books were never actually in Codrington's hands. They were bought for him via an agent whilst he was abroad, and he never came back to see them. Nevertheless, in November 2020, All Souls announced that it would cease to informally refer to the library that had been built as a result of the money as the Codrington Library. It also announced a further series of responses, including the erection of a memorial plaque to those who worked in slavery on the Codrington plantations in the West Indies, and a series of donations to a college founded by Codrington in Barbados. The statue of Codrington, which stands at the centre of the library, remains there. It's now part of an art piece aiming to recognise and respond to his legacy, adding to it rather than hiding it. And what you can see there is part of the art piece that projected the names of the enslaved people from the sort of register onto the statue. At around the same time, a similar response was being undertaken at the British Library. The British Museum, of which the library is an offshoot, was founded in 1753 following the death of former Royal College of Physicians President Sir Hans Sloane. Sir Hans Sloane's collection of books, plants, other objects were sold to the nation for the sum of £20,000. And that's really the point at which this division between sort of institutional and individual becomes helpful, I think. By the end of his life, Sloane's collections are so big that they sort of cease to belong to him. And they have this snowballing effect where, as especially physicians and scientists die, they leave their collections to Sloane, and he sort of encompasses other people's libraries and collections. Books from merit certainly end up there. Today, Sloane's bust sits within the entrance hall alongside other founders of the library, Robert Cotton, Joseph Banks, and Thomas Grenville. As with the statue of Codrington, Sloane's bust was reinterpreted in 2020. Its new label takes the form of 2 paragraphs. The first gives simple biographical information about Sloane. He worked as a doctor, a scientist. He was the secretary for the Royal Society. He worked in his early career on plantations in Jamaica. He used the expertise of enslaved West Africans to form his collections and to form the intellectual knowledge behind the collections. And perhaps most pertinently, he married the heiress to a sugar plantation. The medical knowledge that Sloane contributed to, both in his writing and his collecting, is explicitly connected here to the violences which took place in the sugar plantation. By recognising this, the British Library is also recognising that there are things which can't be done. There'd be no benefit to changing the catalogues to erase Sloane's name. In fact, doing so would mean losing sight of a huge part of the reason why the British Library is organised the way that it is, or why some of the books once owned by Sloane are held in the Royal College of Physicians today. These are just 2 examples of how relatively large libraries have begun to address their difficult provenances. And they rest on sort of this relationship. The general consensus when it comes to these histories in heritage collections has been that individual circumstances, individual collections differ and that there can be no one-size-fits-all approach. I don't disagree. But I don't need to disagree with this policy to also believe that there can be a space to ask bigger conceptual questions about what it means to work with and within these named collections. I therefore want to finish by spending some time thinking about how provenance work in the future might balance the competing needs of these two areas of research: the ownership histories of books, which are vital, and the ways in which they can be entangled in difficult histories. The first thing that we can do is just to begin to think more critically about when we use names, when it might be helpful, for example, in maintaining provenance, and when it might simply be repeating the power structures of the past. The biggest case study we have of heritage institutions actively addressing the names attached to their spaces and collections comes from a very different approach, comes from the wave of announcements dropping the Sackler Family Association, which came from Oxford, Tufts, Yale, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Guggenheim Museum, the National Gallery, the British Museum, the V&A, the Tate, the Royal College of Art, and even Shakespeare's Globe. And this was led by the sort of popular media reactions to the ongoing US opioid epidemic, led primarily by journalist Patrick Redden-Keefe's Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty, as well as a resulting Netflix show called Painkiller. What's interesting to me is that what seemed previously like a sort of visible invisibility, names on the walls of lecture theatres and galleries that were looked at, but more realistically looked through, suddenly became visibly visible, replete with negative connotations. The tangibility of the violences which the Sackler family were being accused of were made clear by advocacy groups such as Artist Nan Golding's PAIN, which stands for Prescription Addiction Intervention Now. And as a result, the connections between violence, money, and name were recognised. Clearly, that's a very different case, but I think as a model for bringing the name to the forefront and thinking about not only the violences and sort of problems, but the idea of the person and people associated with these books as kind of active forces, it can really help shine a lot of light on what provenance is doing. But lots of historically great philanthropists have made their money through immoral means is an understatement. Some would argue that it may as well be a tautology, that there's no ethical way to earn the sort of vast amounts of money that can be returned as donations or bequests. That's certainly the language used by PAIN. But we can see it's not this simple when it comes to books. The connections between books, historical money, and the names attached to them are less easy to follow. Sort of looks more like this, and the dotted lines show potential rather than kind of certainty. My answer to this then is to put us back into the equation. We cannot undo the historical violences that might have helped fund the purchase, and in some cases, the direct printing of these books, or of the intellectual progress they represent and continue to represent. These are still books which we use to generate new knowledge. It's difficult. We benefit, I think, from acknowledging the difficulty, facing it head on rather than looking away and shrugging. The librarian and critical classification study scholar Melissa Adler uses Jennifer Scuro's concept of grief work, the idea of a necessary labour that cannot be glossed over and gotten over, to understand her own feelings about working in libraries. For me, she writes, historical critical classification research is grief work. It is an ongoing course of mourning. The process of recognising the legacy that slavery has had in contributing to and constructing our national institutions is also one of grief work. It's unpleasant and it's uncomfortable, or it can be. And it's all the more so because it is to some extent endless. Grief work can never be completed. It's always ongoing. But to recognise that process allows us to do justice to libraries, to the future work they enable us to do, and to move forward in a productive way. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Alice. That was really interesting.